All literature reflects the conditions in which the author was writing. Homer composed epic poetry about gods, kings, and warriors. Steeped in oral tradition, Tolkien crafted a new mythology for England in modern English prose of a reluctant Christ-like hero, very different from the heroes of ancient Greek epic. And Aldous Huxley wrote his dystopian science fiction novel, A Brave New World, often read alongside 1984, having lived through World War I and witnessing the first years of the Great Depression. And he had deep concerns about modern trends in the 20th century. As far as modern authors are concerned, Huxley is for me the closest approximation of the wise old man archetype in myth, sometimes represented by a prophet who has the gift or curse of prophecy and who is blind. Coincidentally, Aldous Huxley did have problems with his eyesight, but it did not prevent him from becoming one of the great authors and perhaps prophets of the 20th century. So I reread this novel recently, and it's amazing how pressing it was and how relevant its questions remain almost a century later for our modern society. It doesn't talk about nuclear fission, space travel, or genetic engineering directly, that is, but it does voice concerns about eugenics, propaganda, subliminal messaging, drugs, and by extension, big pharma, in vitro fertilization, which overlaps with genetic engineering, as well as asking timeless questions about the struggle in every civilization to find a balance between chaos and stability. It's an exercise in critical thinking, which means you must present the best possible arguments from both sides, and it's clear who's right in my opinion, but a debate is not interesting if the answer is completely unambiguous. The first part is where most of the references are, looking at the major themes and characters. The second part is more topical, where I go deeper into the controversial history of eugenics and also genetic engineering, which is more the focus of the film Gattaca, which was inspired by Huxley's Brave New World, and also the COVID pandemic. The title derives from Shakespeare's The Tempest. How beauteous mankind is, O brave new world, that has such people in it. When John, Huxley's main protagonist, who has read all of Shakespeare's works, says the same thing, there is a double irony. He should be aware of the trap that Shakespeare's character Miranda has walked into when she arrives in Italy, Naples, Italy, but he's not. He is naive of civilization, hence the noble savage archetype, which would explain why he doesn't appreciate the irony. What can be said of the reader of the novel? Both characters, Miranda and John, as I'll discuss later, are outsiders. We don't know what happens to Miranda when she arrives in Naples. In a sense, as Grushau argues, Brave New World can be viewed as a sequel to Shakespeare's The Tempest. The term dystopia derives from the ancient Greek dous, bad, and topos, place, that is, a place ill-conditioned for human life. Brave New World is like 1984, a crushingly fossilized society with a caste system with zero mobility between the castes. In this case, it's a system prescribed by eugenical policies rather than endogamy, like India's caste system, for example, since in Brave New World the entire nuclear family is banned. The novel was published in 1932. Huxley lived through the First World War, wrote after the beginning of the Great Depression, and it is, in a sense, a parody of the utopian societies that other science fiction novels had described before these events that were very optimistic about the future. In fact, it's very similar to William Golding's Lord of the Flies, a response to Ballantyne's Coral Island. In any case, dystopian novels are dark, but they're also compelling and as well. For lack of a better term, it's essentially the biblical scale tragic fall of not just a single individual, like in Greek tragedy, or even a civilization. It's the whole of humanity. So in Brave New World, there's a 9 years war modeled after, I think, the Great War, World War I, and a great economic collapse, which he describes on page 48. It's World War I, subsequent Great Depression. It was so cataclysmic, like the aftermath of World War I, but even worse. In fact, it's kind of predicting the outcome of the Second World War. But it was so bad that people had reached a point of such desperation that they willingly gave up their freedom completely for stability. Compared with 1984, Huxley states in the foreword, a really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. What would it take for people to reach that state? Huxley has an interesting way that he describes freedom on page 46. There was something called liberalism, the freedom to be a round peg in a square hole. It implies that freedom is not intrinsically a virtue, like courage or wisdom, for example, nor unproblematic, but it's necessary, for one thing, to be able to find and pursue your destiny, your purpose in life, with all the dangers and perils that implies, rather than be given one by someone else that doesn't fit. Moral education, which ought never in any circumstances to be rational. Director of Hatcheries and Conditioning. Now really the opposite is true. Moral philosophy is related to the sciences, but does not deal with factual data like the scientific disciplines. If you don't use reason, though, how exactly are you determining your morality? Another tool, empiricism, deriving conclusions from observation and or experience through reason, is likewise rendered moot, especially so because a Brave New World suppresses human feelings and individualism. The elite in the world state know that the society is based on the noble lie, a term coined by Plato in the Republic, for the sake of stability. The motto of the world state is community, identity, and stability. Community is interesting. I talked about Aristotle in one of my presentations. Marx was a reader of Aristotle, and they did generally, ancient societies, put community over individual. Identity is interesting also. In the same vein, the identity politics of the left wing and also the right, they both do it, extremists on both sides. They want people to assume that a group will think the same way, and you should identify with like a group based on superficial qualities, skin color, gender, sexual orientation, whatever. The regime in Brave New World, the castes think this way. It's based on a kind of groupthink. It's a part of their conditioning. For example, I'll talk about this later, but if you're in a caste, you all are supposed to think alike and all wear the same clothes, etc. And when you start to think this way, it really is difficult to take pride in your own achievements if you're belonging to a caste and there's no mobility upwards. And so when someone says, like, on the right, for instance, take pride in your white race, it's like, take pride in your own achievements. And then on the other side, if you say something as innocuous as all lives matter, and I remember there was one woman who was canceled, and she just wasn't like aware of what, you know, of the dangers of saying something like that. It shouldn't be, but she said it, and she was canceled. You say something like that, all lives matter, and you're racist. It's both sides are bullies, and the regime in Brave New World is not like as coercive or as just overt. It doesn't rely on overt violence and brutality as much as 1984. Individualism is strongly discouraged. And of course the response to this and response now is no, I won't, when someone tells you to do this. And it's really troubling for the false prophets and the bullies if enough people say no, I won't. The first person that starts to think this from the system is Bernard Marx, and he starts to veer that path with after he meets John the Savage from outside of civilization, who gets him to start to think differently. The world state consists of a rigid hierarchy, with its citizens bred and conditioned in laboratories through barbaric Pavlovian techniques, such as oxygen deprivation for the lower castes, like the epsilons. There is zero social mobility, by design. The so-called savage, John, is better educated than the world state's elite. He's a Shakespearean enthusiast, if not scholar, and has memorized a lot of lines. The alphas, who are conditioned in the laboratories as well, they're conditioned to dislike books and also nature with shock treatments. Huxley uses the term on page 19, neo-Pavlovian. There is a kind of subliminal messaging known as sleep teaching or hypnopedia, and in addition, mass consumption of goods, unlimited drugs, and sex to keep people tuned out and distracted. Huxley was remarkably prescient in this. With respect to our own society today, the mass consumption of consumer goods, I don't think Huxley was opposed to capitalism a priori as much as he was concerned about people being lured into servitude, into a mindless existence without purpose, which you can read against the more traditional brute force tactics of the regime in 1984. So on the topic of hedonism, that is the view that it's only pleasure that matters. He writes on page 220, from the mouth of Mustafa Ahmad, one of the bureaucrats, high-ranking bureaucrats. You have to choose between happiness and what people call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. We have the feelies and the scent organ instead. John's response is, yeah, but they don't mean anything. Hedonism is anti-philosophy, and it's part of the social conditioning, and part of this in turn involved the destruction of the nuclear family and ostracizing of the terms mother and father, one of the more kind of weird and disturbing elements of the novel. I just finished watching The Godfather, and it is interesting how different the Italian way of life is compared to Brave New World. It's like the state is dead last. First it's your family, and then your region, and then finally maybe the country of Italy. And really that is the natural way. It's like first there was, the family, the clan, the tribe, this idea of this abstract notion of state, and putting that first, it does seem like unnatural and kind of horrifying. And here's another example. So, for you must remember, says one of the bureaucrats, that in those days of gross viviparous reproduction, children were always brought up by their parents, and not in the state conditioning centers. So, basically, people have few responsibilities. And I think Dr. Jordan Peterson has talked about this multiple times. It's like taking on more responsibility it's one way to get out of a depression. Like, at least you're moving towards some kind of objective here in this society, as few responsibilities as possible. And of course, people do have depression. But they have this drug called soma that I'll talk about in a moment to deal with the consequences of that. So for people who need a purpose in their lives, which indeed is most of us, the kind of mindless, purposeless existence in Brave New World is a total fucking nightmare. It's meant to be a parody of the utopians, and there's a lot of dark humor. Like, for example, I recall a scene at the beginning where there's a group of school children in a laboratory, and, someone says mother, and everyone's like, it's the M word, and everybody acts like it's a curse word. It's funny, but it's also like you're wondering what exactly was going on that Huxley was, observing then, but you would know now. The nuclear family, at least in the West, has been hit pretty hard. Here's another example. Remember that in the reservation, this was the helicopter pilot talking to Marx as he was flying in to see the savages. He says, remember that in the reservation, children still are born, yes, actually born, revolting as that may seem. And it really is a testament to Huxley's talent as an author that I was laughing through most of Brave New World while realizing and appreciating how effective it was as a warning on where 20th century society is going. It's dark humor, it's dystopian, but it's hilarious how well and effective they've been brainwashed. And so speaking again on the hedonism, I was watching a documentary on the 1960s, and the hippies got a lot of stuff right, but some of their ideas were not so persuasive. There was a group of British hippies talking about their youth and how naive and impractical a notion of free love was, which is kind of like the society in Brave New World. There's no families, everyone has sex with everybody, and it's like that. It's impractical. For some people it may work. For me, no. Happily married. But when you have a relationship, there are pair bonding chemicals that the body releases. For most people, polyamory, as it's called, is not workable. But one hippie described her experience at Woodstock, and this is like what it would be like, Brave New World in practice. A row of guys just lined up and started taking their clothes off on the ground, and, she said, this isn't for me, and, unsurprisingly ran out. For most women, for most people, it's just this doesn't work. And so you really have to be programmed into this to believe this. Not surprisingly, most ideas from pubescent teenagers with little life experience, usually poorly thought out. It's not free love. It never was. Free sex is not the same as free love. Maybe if you're talking about compassion, you could make an argument in that case, but not with your body, and it doesn't work. But as you'll read, that is one of the key components of Brave New World. In 1984, they controlled the elites by no sex at all. Our Ford, or our Freud, as for some inscrutable reason he chose to call himself whenever he spoke of psychological matters, our Freud had been the first to reveal the appalling dangers of family life. I don't think Huxley was opposed to abortion. It does come up briefly in Brave New World. He's more opposed to, I think, lack of self-awareness, lack of meaning, lack of curiosity, lack of virtue. For me, I'm not really opposed to it either. I mean, there's arguments for both sides. I think if you show up and you want an abortion, and, birth control was, the birth control pill was after, I think, Huxley published the novel. I'm not for sure, but again, it's another example of the prescience of this novel. In any case, if you show up and you couldn't avail yourself of the 12 or more different kinds of birth control, you're probably too irresponsible to be a parent. So I'm not opposed to abortion either, but he does talk about it. It's that's all I'll say on that. In the event you've conceived the natural way, like John's mother, there's no shortage of abortion centers in civilization. But if you read the novel, his mother, Linda, she's quite the hero. A heroine who's stranded there has to deal with a lot of abuse from the Indians. I mean, they have their problems too. Not as many problems as civilization. Civilization is critiqued pretty hard in Brave New World, but it's not like no one is perfect here, or anyone is perfect. But in any case, there's no shortage of abortion centers in civilization to escape consequence, to escape responsibility, and to go back to your zombie-like mindless hedonism. And like I said, it turns out his mother is really, for me, the most sympathetic and heroic of all the characters. So that's a good segue into Hypnopedia. Bram Stoker's Dracula was published 1897, which also had some Freudian themes in it, including hypnosis. Dracula used the technique to seduce women. He's essentially like a rapist. I mean, only it's metaphorical. He's a creep, but it's interesting how Van Helsing uses the same tool, the technology, the knowledge, the wisdom, completely differently. It's the same with genetic engineering. It is a tool. I'll talk more about this later. It's a tool. It depends on who's using it. That's the issue. In the wrong hands, it's a problem. In Brave New World, so Lenina, this is one of Bernard Marx's girlfriends. She suddenly remembered an occasion when, as a little girl at school, she had woken up in the middle of the night and become aware for the first time of whispering that had haunted all her sleeps. I chose this quote here to illustrate it. In fact, that was probably the creepiest moment, at least for me, during my reading of Brave New World, was this. Huxley says there's around 62,000 repetitions per slogan while they're sleeping on page 40. And the following are some examples of the propaganda, the slogans of the world state. Everyone belongs to everyone else. What a hideous color khaki is. I don't know if that was one of the slogans. I included it anyways because it illustrates the groupthink in Brave New World, a caste system. So this was spoken, I believe, by Lenina while they were looking down upon the epsilons or deltas, whatever it is. It's sort of like a conditioned response to seeing people trained to be prejudiced. And it's interesting because Bernard Marx has himself internalized the world state's prejudices. He's internalized the views because he's an alpha. He's at the top, but he's slightly shorter than the norm, and he feels guilty about it, among other things. Everybody's happy now. This is a lie. Not everyone is happy in the Brave New World. It reminds me of the Soviet Union. I looked this up in preparation for this presentation. I wasn't familiar with this, but it's really creepy. The diagnosis called sluggish schizophrenia. So if you weren't happy with the system, you were diagnosed incorrectly. You were diagnosed, though, with this, and you were discriminated against. And it was especially sinister because this diagnosis, it doesn't matter if you were schizophrenic or not. You were diagnosed if you were dissenting, if you were criticizing the system. And then you would be subject to discrimination. And then never put off until tomorrow the fun you can have today. So on the topic of drugs, swallowing half an hour before closing time, that second dose of soma had raised a quite impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Well, drugs are always going to be part of society. I drink a lot of coffee. Caffeine is a drug. I brew beer at home. That's fun. And the body naturally produces feel-good chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, opiates, DMT when you're sleeping. He's not against drugs. Aldous Huxley. I mean, if you've read Doors of Perception, he tried mescaline. It's the irresponsible use of drugs to tune out, get distracted, not pay attention, and not seek the truth. That's essentially what he's talking about here. Soma is the key drug that the state manufactures and encourages people to take whenever they feel like thinking or feel sad. It's an antidepressant, and it's also kind of like ecstasy. It causes euphoria. And I don't know where exactly this comes from. I looked into it. There's a drink in the ancient Hindu tradition that is named Soma. It was possibly a psychedelic drug. I initially thought as a classical philologist that it was derived from somnum, which is the Latin term for sleep, because it is kind of a sedative to keep people sleeping and not awake, metaphorically, but it's probably comes from the Hindu tradition. Huxley became sort of a mystic in his later life and became very interested in the Eastern religions. In any event, the purported goal of psychedelics is the opposite of Soma, to connect you to the universe. There's a scene, page 85, where a group of people take Soma and they perform a ritualized dance in praise of the regime. It's something you would see in North Korea. And someone stupidly asks, wasn't it wonderful? Wasn't it simply wonderful? And it's like a blank expression. And she says she looked at Bernard with an expression of rapture, but of rapture in which there was no trace of agitation or excitement. For to be excited is still to be unsatisfied. So I listened to Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception on audiobook on a road trip, pardon the pun. I haven't had any trips myself. I've not used any psychedelics yet, but from what I gather, the purpose is to alter your state of mind and perception, and you see reality a little differently. Your senses are enhanced or changed a little bit. So basically, the result is skepticism, and skepticism is the opposite of what a totalitarian regime wants. They don't want you to be skeptical of the truth, because curiosity leads you to seek the truth, which is not what they want. So I think he's definitely not against drugs. You shouldn't reach that conclusion if you read Brave New World. Basically comes down to nothing to excess, as the Greeks would say. The Feelies are films where viewers, this is not necessarily drug related, but taps into sensation. The Feelies are films where viewers can smell and touch the scenes, in a manner of speaking, but they don't feel the emotions of the actors. The films are too stupid and superficial for that. They're not deep, they're anti-intellectual, they're not designed to spur thought. When people go to a film in Brave New World, it's not to think at all. And I have to say, it kind of reminds me of a lot of films Hollywood produces today. Like, they're quite brainless, and for me, they're really boring. Not every artsy indie film is necessarily that thought-provoking, but most are pretty stupid. The films that Hollywood produces, and virtually all, art's been extinguished, I think you could say, in Brave New World. Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company, mass-produced the Model T, the first affordable automobile and most influential automobile of the 20th century. He revolutionized production with his factory assembly lines. This is very important because, Huxley saw this, lived through this. The society of the world state in Brave New World is modeled off the mass production of the Model T car, only with human beings. And, as a consumer, as a person who's not for pure capitalism, but definitely a regulated kind of capitalism, I'm definitely not opposed to quality controls. But I don't have an issue with that, but I do have it with people, genetically engineered people. That I'm not for. So Henry Ford was a technological genius and extraordinarily successful industrialist, but he was also authoritarian, stubborn, paternalistic, and we can see a lot of his personality traits in the controller of Western Europe, Mustafa Mond. Henry Ford in the world state is hero-worshipped. The reckoning of time in Brave New World is not Anno Domini in the year of our Lord. It's replaced with Anno Ford in the year of our Ford. This is more of the dark comedy elements. It's funny and creepy. Historically, this is, for me as a student of history, as a student of the classics, this is usually an ominous sign when the human being, a man, is elevated to godlike status. That is, you're worshiping the man himself and not the forms, the idea. Like in, for example, the Soviet Union, when they hastily extirpated religion from society, but without a worthy substitute. For me, my substitute is philosophy. Religious or not, it's disturbing when you see a mere man, a mere human being, become the object of a religious-like cult, like Stalin, for example. Jesus Christ, I would say that Jesus Christ, to me, is a personification of the forms that Plato was talking about. And of course, Plato influenced a lot of the later Christian literature. Stalin, on the other hand, he's a symbol of the state, but really it doesn't go deeper than that. And that's dangerous. What is the moral underpinning of your state? So in any event, the ideology of the world state, effective in maintaining stability at all costs, it has to do so with this very brutal and comprehensive conditioning program that has essentially destroyed human freedom and human emotion. And the use of this notion of Fordism reveals what Huxley was doing in the novel, that is, a parody of some of the overly, ridiculously optimistic utopian novels that were written at the same time. And of course, after World War I, that sort of part of the zeitgeist was untenable. And then especially so with the desperation with the stock market crash in 1929. And Huxley began writing 2 years after that. So John, the protagonist, was born illicitly on an Indian reservation. Both of his parents, however, were fully conditioned citizens of the world state. He and his mother Linda were stranded there, and they became both outsiders on the reservation and not quite fitting into civilization when they returned. It is interesting how the Indians are not exactly without their own problems in the novel. They have their own prejudices. They treat Linda and John cruelly at times. Pages 126, 129, there's a bit of culture clash, as you can see there. What they offer, though, is very important. It's really nothing short of humanity, with all of its frailties and its strengths, and they don't run away from it. There's a concept of heroism in this society that's been quenched in civilization. They don't believe they need heroes at all anymore. Case in point, page 114, there's a fertility ritual that incorporates a lot of symbolism from Indian beliefs and also Christianity. And no doubt it would, such a ritual would go way over the heads of your typical world state citizen. It's like they can't appreciate that kind of thing anymore, or they've not been encouraged to appreciate it. They're not trained to. It's just like you have to train to be able to think critically. For example, on page 114, slowly raised by invisible hands from below, there emerged from the one a painted image of an eagle, from the other that of a man naked and nailed to a cross. For the sake of the pueblo, to make the rain come and corn grow. It's essentially a fertility rite. So, and to please Pukong and Jesus, and then to show that I can bear pain without crying out. John was a volunteer to basically symbolically reenact the Passion of the Christ, and to sacrifice himself, as a hero traditionally does in the myths and the legends for the sake of the community. So, and it's worth reminding, before Homer put Greek myth to meter in his Iliad and Odyssey, the caretakers of those stories were illiterate. They passed on the stories of Achilles and Hercules, etc., through oral tradition. And I don't want to underestimate civilization as much as Huxley does, but it's still worth remembering that, all of our ancestors at one point were illiterate. This does not mean that they were unsophisticated. Quite the contrary. And that is one of the big ironies of the Brave New World. John, who is known as a savage, it's like we're all savages, though. Every single one of us is, to some degree, a savage. Civilization just is not that old yet, which is why the society in Brave New World is really so sinister. It's against human nature. But does John himself represent the noble savage archetype? The noble savage, in reality and in the novel, is bullshit. What I mean is, if you remove yourself away from civilization, it may make you more humble, but if you're like a violent sociopath and you live in the jungle, guess what? You're still a violent sociopath. This should be obvious. Civilization is relatively new. Given the amount of time human beings throughout the world have lived in hunter-gatherer societies. As a student of Roman history, the barbarians were no less skilled than the Romans in their daily lives. The Gauls may not have built aqueducts and highways and amphitheaters, but their metalworking was more advanced in some ways than the Romans. Their abstract, geometric style art was speaks for itself. So returning to John, John is an educated intellectual who is steeped in the world of Shakespeare, the only literatures he has read, since books are hard to come by in this many centuries into the future in the Brave New World. And I think Huxley thought a Shakespearean character who is very emotional and very passionate would best highlight how emotionally dead the zombies are of the world state. The rebel archetype fits John the best. He's not someone that I would want around me for very long because he's so outrageously emotional and passionate all the time. He acts like he's on Adderall, as do most of Shakespeare's characters, by the way. And most of my sympathy really is for his mom, Linda, who, despite her conditioning, does not neglect her duties as a mother on the reservation, despite being stranded, despite being in this somewhat hostile environment, does not neglect her duties despite every reason to do so in very tragic circumstances. She's quietly quite a heroic character. I did pick up on some of the allusions to Shakespeare's works in the novel. I've not read Hamlet, but I have read Julius Caesar. In some, John is a tragic hero in the sense that he is courageous in a world that really doesn't want him. Towards the end of the novel, there's a battle at the drug dispensary when he's trying to give freedom to the lower castes. It really is the last gasp of freedom in this world, although there are islands where you can go if you want to. It's kind of ominous because Mustafa Mann says it's like in the future we may have to deal with the islands, but at least in the novel you can go to one of the islands. So at the hospital drug dispensary, he opens with Mark Antony's speech to his fellow Romans after the death of Julius Caesar. He says, "Lend me your ears." He had never spoken in public before and found it very difficult to express what he wanted to say, but he did it anyways. "Don't take that horrible stuff, it's poison. It's poison." Then he says, "I come to bring you freedom." So a riot ensues, and unfortunately it seems like the lower castes have been so well conditioned by the policies of the regime that they want their drugs more than freedom. And the police arrive, and they spray everyone with soma gas, and everyone's like soon laughing and hugging one another. Conflict diffused. It's not quite as brutal as say the Peterloo massacre, where the cavalry charged in and started chopping people up. But make no mistake, this society, like ours, is underpinned in the worst case scenario by force, by violence. John is arrested, and he speaks with the world controller, who I'll talk about in a moment. The debate is an interesting one. It's critical thinking. Best possible arguments are presented to both sides. I don't think necessarily John wins, but he's right. It's just that the other guy is extremely intelligent. He has no doubt, like all the world controllers, has rationalized his actions over and over again in his mind. Most literature, the classics at least, I've known the ending beforehand. It's hard not to, like with Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, it's hard not to know how that one's going to end. Huxley said that if he had to rewrite it, he would offer a third alternative between his insanity and society's insanity. And I think what he was getting at was the Aristotelian mean, the golden mean, in this case some kind of balance between chaos and stability. To undertake the hero's journey, the protagonist, like John, must have freedom, and the perils that the adventure entails, and the sense of heroism is encapsulated by his discussion with the controller. For example, he says, "I don't want comfort, I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, and I want sin." It's a Pinocchio-like scene because of its self-awareness. Brave New World is an exercise in critical thinking because Huxley provides the best possible arguments that he can for John and also Mustafa Mann, the world controller of Western Europe. And if you're a truth seeker, if you're seeking the truth, you do kind of have to engage with the devil's advocate. That doesn't mean that he's right, but you really have to test your theories and your argument. So the debate between John and Mustafa presents the best arguments from their perspectives. And I noted earlier, it's not exactly clear that the hero wins. I mean, he's not going to convince anyone from civilization. No, I take that back. He does persuade Bernard Marx, who goes to one of the islands, but he's not going to convince one of the top-level bureaucrats, like Mond, for example. And that's what I like about this novel. There's no useless characters. Everyone has a purpose in the novel. Mustafa Mond kind of reminds me of Thersites, the commoner, in the very class-biased Iliad. He's a commoner, but he still has a good argument. In that case, I agree with Thersites. In this case, Mustafa Mond, he's wrong. The Society of Brave New World is a nightmare, but it's interesting to listen to the actual argument that he presents. Why don't you let them see Othello instead? John asks. Mustafa responds, I've told you it's old. Besides, they couldn't understand it. And John admits, through his experience with civilization at least, that is unfortunately true. Most of the people he's encountered probably couldn't understand it. Most people can't understand Shakespeare now. It's not the same kind of world that Shakespeare inhabited. As he says, you can't make tragedies without social instability. The world's stable now, people are happy, they get what they want, etc., etc. You can see how persuasive this would be to some people who, had lost all their savings in the stock market crash, or veteran World War I suffering from PTSD. I believe Huxley's brother was a veteran of the war. I'm not saying that they would accept it, but it's not an interesting argument if there's no merit to it. And you can look at our society today. The novel was meant not exactly to be a prophecy, but to be a cautionary tale. And you can just see how prescient it is when you go into a public place and see parents distracted by their smartphones instead of playing with their kids, for example. There's a lot of people disengaged in our society. He goes on to say, we have our stability to think of. We don't want change. Every change is a menace to stability. Now, this is naive to me. Mustafa Mond, no doubt very intelligent, well-educated. He has most of the banned books in his office, so he's read this stuff. That's a naive statement. Lack of adaptability is not a virtue. Evolution continues. You can't ignore that chaos, change, is an element of the universe. In fact, as soon as you fossilize, as soon as you have an excess amount of order that's so stifling, that's a recipe for revolution. The only thing worse, or second worst, to total stability is the chaos of a revolution. But most people, if you look at history, have to be pushed really far before they resort to a revolution. So when they talk about religion, John says, if you allowed yourselves to think of God, you wouldn't allow yourselves to be degraded by pleasant vices. You'd have reason for bearing things patiently, for doing things with courage. I've seen it with the Indians. And he says, I'm sure you have, but then we aren't Indians. And you might argue that John wins the debate here, because you see this in debates on TV and YouTube. When you're wrong, just dodge the question. And he's right here. So anyways, you get the idea of the big debate at the end of the novel. Mustafa Mond seems almost like he wins the debate, but I think he's as stubborn as Henry Ford is. Talked about that earlier. But we know he's wrong, but it's a good discussion here. The point is this: humanity didn't evolve in stasis. Evolution continues, circumstances change, and lack of adaptability is simply not a virtue. That's the practical argument. The more emotional one is simply this society, it's just not worth the price of. You can't. If you destroy human emotion, you're destroying human beings. It's not likely that it would go this far. But again, that's never the point in science fiction. It's a thought experiment, and sometimes it's overstated to make the point. In logic, this fallacy presents a false choice to people. You have two choices, and those are the only two choices. Rarely is that the case. This is key to the novel, and it's a problem that civilization has dealt with for millennia. The correct path, the golden mean between freedom and chaos, and servitude and slavery. It is interesting when civilizations, 2,000 years apart, produce authors who are raising very similar questions about their contemporary societies. Tacitus, one of Rome's greatest historians, wrote an account of the civil war following Nero's death. Long story short, there's a Roman general. He addresses a crowd of rebels, of Gauls, and he advises the following. Histories, Book 4, 73-74. Let the lessons of fortune in both its forms teach you not to prefer rebellion and ruin to submission and safety. That's a fallacy. Obviously, the correct choice is the golden mean. And if you read Tacitus, all of these generals and officers are kind of shady characters. But he does have a point there, at least he could be persuasive. Huxley states that if he had to write the novel again, he would have offered a third alternative to the world state and also to the fate of John. He goes insane, and that would be reason, fundamental to moral philosophy. And it would be the mean between, the best option between total freedom and total chaos, and on the other side, total servitude and total safety. For me, I would lean more towards the freedom side of the spectrum, but of course not all the way, not to the libertarian side. There was a guy on podcast recently who was talking about an epidemic of cholera in New Orleans, and the company basically just said we have a right to dump pig guts anywhere. They just ignored regulations, and the regulations were impossible to enforce. It's like total chaos I'm not for. I don't care for that. But asking the world state in Brave New World for security is like asking a wolf to guard the chickens. In fact, it reminds me of like the protection rackets of the mafia. It's not feasible. And in fact, people are already starting to resist it. At least Bernard Marx is one of the alphas who was born with some quote-unquote defects, at least in his mind. He still has some measure of skepticism, I think, in part due to being an outsider. Some of his physiognomy, his traits don't line up with what an alpha supposed to be. And he asks, what would it be like if I were free, not enslaved to my conditioning? And Lenina says, his girlfriend, I don't know what you mean. I am free to have the most wonderful time. Everybody's happy nowadays. The problem with surrendering your freedom is, what if you don't like the outcome? By then it's too late. Furthermore, the price in this society is extremely high. The loss of freedom, suppression of natural feelings, results in the total destruction of art and innovation. As John says, art, science, you seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness. Anything else? Well, religion, of course, replied the controller. So, I will stop here. This will be part 1. This is where most of the references, major themes, characterization are. And in part 2, since this is a bigger project than I intended it to be in the beginning, I'll split off here. Part 2 will discuss the influence of Brave New World on Gattaca, and I'll discuss more of eugenics, which, without the very disturbing eugenics policies that were very popular in Huxley's day, I'm not really sure he would have been as disturbed as he was even with the other events that were happening. But once you read into that, you can understand why people like Huxley were concerned. And it'll also get into genetic engineering as well, which overlaps. It's related to what Huxley was talking about.